Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you all for this online symposium that is being held by Insan Organization for Rights and Freedoms. We held this organization as a matter of obligation from our organization for the people in Palestine and particularly in Gaza. After 200 days of genocide in Gaza, we will discuss today the role or the international role in supporting the Palestinian people to achieve justice, political and legal analysis of the Israeli war on Gaza. Today, we are gathering here to discuss a matter of grave concern, the ongoing Israeli violations in its war on Gaza. As we convene, the people of Gaza continue to endure relentless attacks, with lives lost, homes shattered and destroyed, and communities shattered. It is imperative that we come together to shed light on these violations, advocate for justice, and explore avenues for meaningful action. I would like to welcome you all. I welcome Dr. Tim Anderson, Director, Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies from Sydney. Welcome, Dr. Tim. Also, Mr. Stephen Pill, Officer in the Stop the War Coalition. Welcome, Mr. Stephen. Ms. Batul Subaiti, Energy Engineer and Political Analyst. Also, Ms. Sundus Al-Assad, a pro-Palestine journalist. And also we have the brother Ali Salam of Basira Press. I welcome you all, and I hope that we will begin listening to the presentation of Dr. Tim Anderson. Dr. Tim, can you hear me? Hello? Dr. Tim? Okay, Mr. Stephen, can you hear me?
Yes. I want to
thank you so much, Mr. Stephen. We will begin listening to your presentation, please.
Okay. I want to thank Insan for the privilege of addressing this symposium. We must begin by acknowledging the extraordinary resilience and courage of the Palestinian people. Their refusal to accept the erasure of their nation is one of the most inspirational stories of the past century. The Palestinians have refused to let the ferocity of the war silence them. Through their social media, the truth of Gaza has traveled the world. Alongside this, the Palestinian diaspora have mobilized and been a crucial voice in the protests across the globe. This counter-narrative has been particularly effective in the global north. In countries like the US, UK, and Germany, the media monopoly has been in favor of the war. Despite the technical preponderance of pro-war opinion, Palestinian voices have undermined all the lies, diversions, sophistry, and hypocrisies of the pro-imperialist, pro-Israeli media. Every cry and explanation from Palestine has found an audience. The Palestinian struggle has created one of history's great international movements. After 200 days, it is still creating new foci. Witness the extraordinary eruption across US campuses these past few days. One thing is certain, the majority of humanity supports the Palestinians. This is registered in both institutional support and popular actions. By institutional support, I refer to the actions of states and governments. In both the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, governments representing the overwhelming majority of the world's population have voted for peace and justice for the Palestinians. Some governments have made exceptional efforts. The Sinai authorities have taken action to prevent genocide as defined by the Geneva Convention. The Red Sea and Gulf of Aden have been blocked for Israeli-related commerce. This has drawn the fury and fire of the US and UK governments, but to no effect. Also exceptional has been the decision of the South African government to bring a case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Already, the court has demonstrated that there is a plausible case of genocide. This has had a major impact, shifting international opinion against Israel. The institutional support has been more than matched by popular support. The massive protests, demonstrations, and organized initiatives have surpassed all previous expressions of support for Palestine. In the global south, the mobilizations have been millions strong, with the biggest actions in Yemen, Indonesia, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. In countries such as Egypt, the state of repression has suppressed mobilizations, but all the evidence points to popular outrage. One immediate product has been the disruption of the normalization process begun by the Abraham Accords. A poll of Arab opinion conducted by the Arab Center Washington in December 2023 and January 2024 across 16 countries found 89% opposing recognition, with only 4% supporting. Key countries registered a shift against normalization. In Saudi Arabia, opposition rose from 38% in 2022 to 68% this year. In Morocco, from 67% to 78%. In Sudan, from 72% to 81%. Egypt registered 84% opposed, 45 years after the peace treaty with Israel. Jordan registered 94%, 30 years after the peace treaty. The survival of Arab governments becomes hazardous if they ignore such domestic opinion. In the global north, governments have generally supported Israel's war. Indeed, both governments and official opposition have promoted the same policy in the US, UK, Germany, etc. But the population disagrees. In December 2023, opinion polls registered 61% of US voters supported US calling for an immediate ceasefire. In January this year, 71% of British voters stated that definitely or probably should be an immediate ceasefire. In January, 61% of German voters said that Israel's military action in Gaza are unjustified. Such dislocation between government policy and public opinion makes government policy more and more difficult to sustain. Obviously, the role of the US is decisive. Britain and Germany are acting as echo chambers for US policy. But for the Biden administration, there is a particular problem. In Ukraine, the NATO-backed government has clearly failed. Even the new $61 billion package of US aid will merely sustain Ukraine's suffering, not defeat Russia. After this, Palestine for Biden is a demonstration of the continuing power of the US. He has doubled down on an Israeli victory. This explains his hesitation and weakness towards the Israeli government. You will recall, for months after October, the US government was setting time limits for the war, the new year, early spring, and so on. But there is no end to Palestinian resistance, let alone a surrender. Biden keeps adjusting his stated aims, and Netanyahu keeps taking advantage of these shifts. In this context, after 200 days of war, we have the outbreak of encampments and occupations by students at the US's most elite universities. These are the future leaders of US society, risking their studies, careers, arrests, and physical assaults. Columbia University, where the new movement started, was also the site of the eruption of the student movement against the US war on Vietnam in 1968. You will recall that the Vietnamese people's resistance created a military impasse overseas, while a huge domestic opposition inside the US brought about the Vietnamese people's victory. A similar process occurred in South Africa. The intransigence of the majority population and their military units in Umkhonto we and SWAPO brought the regime to military deadlock, aided by the Cuban troops defeating apartheid forces in Angola. At the same time, the international campaigns to isolate apartheid through boycott, divestment, and sanctions was sustained by masses of activists across the world, but notably so in the imperialist powers. This combination engineered the conditions for the end of apartheid. These examples demonstrate what is possible by international alliances that support an oppressed people. We must continue our support for Palestine until final victory. Shukran.
Thank you so much, Mr. Steve, for your presentation. Thank you so much. We will now listen to the presentation of the energy engineer and political analyst from the UK, Batul Subaiti. Welcome, Batul.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Latif, and to the organisation. It's my absolute honour to join you all. So yes, my topic will be focusing on the continuation of the war in Gaza and whether that would lead to a regional war. So here we want to begin by putting into perspective what defines the direction of struggle from a historical viewpoint. So of course that is the struggle ultimately between the arrogant powers, so namely the American project and the liberation forces on the ground in the region of West Asia. This is something that we know did not begin in October the 7th. It's been ongoing for some time, and of course has been a direct result of the both the direct American transgressions on the countries of the region, of course through various means, and this also includes the Israeli occupation entity that we know, of course, acts as their advanced military conspiracy headquarters in the region. So the occupation of Palestine, no doubt, is what has been the fuel for unrest in the region of West Asia for all these decades, because humanity, I would argue, has not witnessed a ferocious occupation of that kind. But ultimately, the American attempts to neutralize, this hostile entity that they created and to allow it to stabilize in the region so it can play its functional role on behalf of the West. This American attempt has failed for two simple reasons. The first is that the first relates to the savagery of the occupation entity. It cannot but transgress. It's inherent to it as a colonial entity. And this entity leaves no room for any compromise to go through. Even if it's in the case that the occupation entity got recognition and legitimacy from its surroundings, for example, through the so-called peace process or through the Oslo Accords, which we know is the most important component for its existence and its security, is to receive that kind of legitimacy. So it's incapable of that. It's incapable of except but transgressing. And number two, the resistance of the nation. That is embodied in the resistance groups on the ground. And so the whole difference post-October the 7th is that the conflict that was within a certain level has become much more heated. And other fronts, have also been involved and coordinated. Of course, we would all know the Lebanese, the Yemeni, the Iraqi, the Syrian front. Despite this, though, the Israeli occupation entity has not quitted its transgressions. It's only heightened it. Even against Iran, against Iran, that is a country that one can say by every yardstick, the Israeli occupation entity cannot stand a chance to even face. It's killed its leaders, a large number of military advisors in Syria as well, and went towards even attacking the consulate. That's a transgression against a red line, which is the sovereignty of Iran. So what results from this is actually what threatens the expansion, of course, because a clear red line was crossed. And so, everyone expected Iran to respond, and Iran made it clear that it would. But if Iran's response was of an existentially threatening nature to the Israeli occupation entity, then America would have had to intervene in a strong manner, likewise, to save its projects from collapse, to save the Israeli occupation entity from collapsing at the hands of the resistance, because that's a big threat for America. A big threat for America is the resistance axis killing off the Israeli occupation entity. Because what happens if they kill off this project? They will sit in its place. Whereas America is the one that wants to be in control of the situation. It is America that wants to reshape and reconfigure the Israeli occupation entity post October the 7th, post ceasefire, rather than let the balance tilt at the hands of the resistance axis, because the Israeli occupation entity is America's project after all, and was created to consolidate their direct their presence in the region, so to speak, indirectly. So the limits for a full-fledged intervention, if that is what we are discussing, the limits of that intervention is when there is a strong response that is really threatening. So this even applies to the side of the resistance, if the resistance axis feared that the Ghazan resistance was weakening on the ground, that is when you would see, for example, the closest fronts expanding. So, for example, Lebanon would transform from a front that is supporting Gaza, which is what it is right now, to directly entering the war and expanding its attacks within the heart of the occupation entity. But it's also important to acknowledge here that it is from the interest of all major sides for the expansion to be controlled and to not spiral into an all-out war, with exception if the Israeli occupation entity does not commit a blunder that leads to expansionism. But of course, given within the basic joints of this war, it is under the American leadership, and the Israeli occupation entity cannot exit the American leadership, management, decision-making in direct matters, especially when the situation does get critical. It is unlikely that the entity is going to commit any action or operation that will lead to expansion of the war. And everyone, saw their miniature response to the big slap that Iran gave them. If America wanted to expand the war, so now we're looking at America, who is like the key player here, we would have seen signs of it. If one looks back at the 90s during the Gulf War, if one looks at the turn of the 21st century during the invasion of Iraq, they sent hundreds and thousands of troops. They enhanced their bases in the region. But today, even if America was to reallocate its forces regionally in a war with Iran, it would take months for them to prepare it, to assemble it. If it wanted to deploy its troops, it would need to access the ports and the airfields where military infrastructure and soldiers can land in. But Iran has the ability to attack these and render them unusable. And they know this very well. And so they know that the mobilization of resources for war is both politically and militarily unsustainable. But also, it's a key fact right now that in a conventional war, America will lose against the Axis because they don't have except planes, and fighter jets, and that cannot conclude victory in a war. The power balance is not in their favor. Every confrontation today with the resistance axis on the ground is weakening the American position in the region. The war of terror years are over. They achieved nothing through these military strategies. And so America overall, of course, hasn't shown any readiness to expand the war. They almost actually sent messages to Iran, that we didn't know that the occupation entity hit your consulate, basically trying to say we're not happy with this. So please respond in a degree that we will not have to intervene in an attack against you. And they made it very clear that they won't support the occupation entity in launching an attack against Iran. The American strategy for the war on Gaza has shifted ultimately from the military campaign. Of course, they funded them with billions and billions, because we have to understand that it is more of an interest for America than it is for the Israeli occupation entity to defeat the Ghazan resistance. But of course, from the American perspective, since the Israeli occupation entity has failed militarily, they have to go towards the political settlement, and instead the occupation entity has to turn towards limited security operations. In that way, through decisively hitting the occupation entity, decisively hitting the resistance, through these limited security operations rather than the indiscriminate bombing and killings. This is their strategy of, and of course, passing the political settlement through. This is their strategy of weakening the Ghazan resistance. It is to bring their Western-friendly entities like the Palestinian Authority, who they wish to reconfigure such that they can establish security control over Gaza. So the idea is that through the interests of the people of Gaza, through reconstruction, through aid, through jobs, through income, that is how America wishes to basically overtake the Ghazan resistance. All of this would be brokered through the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, these normalizing countries. Now, if we look towards the resistance axis and its perspective on expansion of the war, the Ghazan resistance wants the war to end because it wants to reconfigure itself. It wants to reduce the suffering on its people. At the same time, all the other participating sides of the resistance axis have made it clear, from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, that its participation in the war is one of support for Gaza. As long as the transgression continues, they will continue to attack, Israeli and American ships. The northern front will be heated until there is a ceasefire in Gaza. That is when Lebanon will commit to that kind of ceasefire of some kind. So it's when the war in Gaza ends, that is when they will stop. Iran didn't announce its entrance into the war as per the title of the war on Gaza, but rather as a response to an attack on its sovereignty, and as an attack on its leaders. And of course, Iran's hit was very successful. But it is clear to us that Gaza was the implicit reason that Iran entered into the war, because the attack on the consulate and the response to it happened during the war on Gaza and was due to it. Iran, however, has been, of course, trying to avoid a regional war because the Iranian response strategy is based on Gaza remaining the focus. You know, if you were to turn it into a regional conflict, that is giving the Israeli occupation entity what it wants. That would free Israel's hand in Gaza because the world would be distracted away from their mass genocide. And that would facilitate Israel's only plan for Gaza, and that is to, create the most unbearable conditions to get rid of Gaza altogether. So the Iranian response comes with what serves the strategy of Gaza remaining under the microscope and not what serves its enemy strategy. And Israel has always wanted America to fight Iran on its behalf because, as we know, Iran is what represents the real existential threat to it. But Iran wants to halt the Israeli war on Gaza, considers that the greatest strategic victory because the war would have ended with the Gazan resistance still standing strong. But at the same time, of course, Iran did send that direct message, and that is that, we would respond, that if the Israeli occupation entity was to respond in a strong manner, it will be something else. And if it's stupid enough to escalate, Iran will give it to them in a way that is much worse. So we can conclude and say for sure that the era whereby America initiates wars and expands them is long gone, since the hegemony that America used to exercise in its fullest manner in the 2000s, as this unipolar entity in the world, that is no longer present. The regional powers today are much stronger. The Axis is united, and the enemy is seeing the results of this harmony, to the point where America cannot even sustain its presence in Iraq without requesting the Iraqi government to hit the Iraqi resistance, the Hashid, and to prevent them from hitting the American bases. That's how vulnerable the situation is today. Of course, the situation now is much heated compared to pre-October the 7th. This has benefited the resistance axis greatly in terms of the military experience on the one hand that they are gaining, but also testing the potential capacity and capabilities of their enemies. You can think of it as like a live exercise, this kind of military maneuver that we're seeing in real time. That of course is imposed, but that has benefited the axis. The extent of the killing of Gaza in Gaza is also something that has turned the Free Palestine slogan into an impacting component on the mass level worldwide. This is something today that absolutely no one can overlook. It might not be decisive enough to bring down governments or to raise them up, but it has advanced in a manner that if the West continued with American sponsorship this war on Gaza, there is a fear that it would expand further and would turn into this effective component in the confrontation. From this, we can conclude overall, the war will not expand, but the possibility of actions going against self-interests occurring when the situation is volatile and heated up is higher, of course, through mistakes and errors. So if a core wrong or a core mistake occurred, you could potentially see the situation deteriorate. So with the continuation of war, it is not in favor of the enemy camp. It's not in favor of America and the Israeli occupation entity. It is a real risk. If the response of Israel on Iran was, stronger, we know that the Iranian involvement would have been greater. It's not that Iran wouldn't escalate. It would escalate, but it is America that is constraining and putting Israel within its containment and its bounds and its reins, because it doesn't want that expansion. But also, if just to kind of conclude on this point, if we were to remove the threat of the nuclear card, of course, although we know that this wouldn't materialize, we wouldn't expect to see a nuclear bomb or a nuclear attack. But if we were to remove this, because we know that's just used as a deterrent, the West overall in its wars has lost monopoly, because it is not just the planes, but it is today the advanced rockets, the drones that play an impacting role. In terms of the power of the resistance and forming a system for these effective weapons and these anti-tank, cruise missiles and all these deterrence weapons, there is now almost, you could say, a parity between the resistance axis and the West in terms of development. No longer is there this kind of gap in military development if we're talking about the current modern wars that rely on high-tech, small, precision weapons. The resistance has developed and almost reached parity. You see countries like Iran, for example, are one of the top 5 in terms of advancement in this regard. So that is also a deterrence factor that doesn't allow with the expansion of the war. an additional factor is given, the US is no longer this unipolar power in the world, during the collapse of the Soviet Union, we saw that, for example, China didn't have this strong ambition, it didn't have this strong presence or expansion as it does today, and it's greatly developing politically and militarily. You have the Silk Road. Russia is very strong in its leadership. It cares about its internal interests. Russia doesn't accept being under the American orbit. So no longer today is the ground free for America. The regional powers, Iran also is strong. It's created enough balance to not allow the expansion of the war, but also the people of the region, in areas where America was walking with them. Take, for example, Egypt. Take, for example, Jordan. Within those countries that follow the American strategy, we are seeing a transformation taking place on the ground that you can argue and say might actually lead to an expansion of this resistance axis, in places like Jordan, for example, which is unprecedented. And this is another point which makes obviously America fearful and wants them to think about reducing tensions in the region and to stabilize it rather than expanding the war. I think I'll stop there because I'm up for time. But yes, I thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Batul. Thank you. And we all hope that the war will not expand in the region. Now, let's listen to Dr. Tim Anderson, the Director of Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies from Sydney. Dr. Tim, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Insan Organisation for organising this seminar and the invitation, and also to the Yemeni people, the Yemeni Armed Forces, for introducing a rather unique clarity and dignity into the forces of the resistance in the region. On the topic of the question of human rights, the role of human rights organisations, I want to start by saying that really the resistance in Gaza and Palestine, of course, is the primary factor in, first of all, defending the existence of the Palestinian people, and second of all, advancing the project of self-determination of the Palestinian people, without which there would be no question of solidarity. So the resistance is primary. We have to start from that point. After that, the question of human rights becomes, in an international debate, becomes important, because it's one of two pretexts that's used these days to legitimize or delegitimize the role of intervention, imperial intervention, Zionist intervention. We know we can see a large number of interventions in Latin America, in Africa, in West Asia, that have used the pretext of human rights or humanitarian intervention alongside the other pretext, which is protection from terrorism, where effectively the imperial and Zionist enemy initiate terrorist actions and then present themselves as the shield or the protector from that. We can see that in Iraq now and in Syria too, where the pretext for the ongoing occupation of Syria and Iraq has been the false claim that the US has been fighting Daesh or ISIS terrorists there, whereas the countries of the region know that they've been supporting that very terrorism precisely to destabilize and undermine the independent peoples of the region. The same sort of thing we can see in Africa. In West Africa, there's been a revolt against that amongst a number of the Sahel states, for example, against the role of the French and the US there. But apart from this question of implanting terrorism, then presenting themselves as the protectors from terrorism, the question of human rights to legitimize and delegitimize interventions and to legitimize and delegitimize independent states is an important one. And in the case of, for example, in past wars against interventions against Cuba, against Venezuela, against Bolivia in Latin America, we've seen the US with its embedded NGOs running human rights arguments to try and overthrow those governments. Nicaragua also comes to mind. Nicaragua is an important small independent state in Central America where fake human rights arguments have been used to try and undermine and delegitimize that government and ultimately overthrow it in a coup, as with Cuba, as with Venezuela, as with Bolivia. Now, in the case of Palestine, it's been rather extraordinary that we notice that some of the organizations that have been associated with Washington in these human rights propaganda wars, that is to say Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch being a large corporation in North America, Amnesty being effectively created in Britain. In other words, organizations from the sponsors of the Zionist entity were felt obliged to come out and join in the multiple reports that were coming in designating the Zionist entity as an apartheid regime, therefore a crime under international law, therefore a crime against humanity which must be dismantled by the international community. Now, some of this has been superseded in recent months, I suppose, by the arguments about genocide in Gaza, but nevertheless, the designation of the Zionist entity as an apartheid regime is a very important one, I think, for the future of international arguments and the dismantling of the Zionist entity, because it's a very clear breach of international law as was created in the 70s in context of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So the question of legitimacy and delegitimacy through human rights arguments becomes an important one. And that's particularly important because now we see the character of Israel having been exposed to the extent that it has been by the slaughter in Gaza. There is this question of international support. Really, the Israeli leadership and the Israeli military has shown itself incapable of defending the Zionist entity. And even in court, there are reports now that the Netanyahu has gone, for example, to the Foreign Office of Britain and Germany to get help in running the case in the International Court of Justice. So there is a multiple incapacity on the part of the Israelis to defend themselves, whether in terms of militarily, in terms of security, or we know there's turmoil within the regime also, which is a great fragility, which may lead to a collapse internally because of the internal contradictions amongst the Israelis, basically, and present the resistance suddenly with a new scenario where I think, as one of the speakers said earlier, there will be an attempt to try and recreate an Israeli entity, perhaps an Israel Mark II, but that by its sponsors. But that will be a very difficult situation because even if they, for example, present some recognition of Palestinian rights as citizens within historic Palestine, there are still questions of all of the land that's been stolen over recent decades, the question of the refugees, for example. So there may be a need to mobilize for the resistance to mobilize very quickly on these questions of international legitimacy. And in that sense, the international resistance human rights organizations like Insan will be very important in countering what I think will come from those organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, will be pushing for some new compromise. Of course, privileging the settler regime and privileging the status quo, I suppose, that the settler regime has created, the colonist regime has created. That is to say, freezing the theft of land that's taken place, which has excluded most of the Palestinian population, for example. Stopping home demolitions, but at the price of recognizing the land that has been colonized already in Al-Khalil and other parts of the West Bank and throughout historic Palestine. So I think the question of breaking the morale of the enemy becomes very important because the war in Gaza, for example, is only ongoing because of international support now. There's no question that the Israeli regime would be finished militarily in terms of what's going on in Gaza at the moment, except that, for the billions of dollars and the weapons that are being pumped into it by the international regime. So in that context, the type of intifada that's happening on North American universities is very important too, because they are hitting at the heart of the arguments of legitimacy for the Israeli regime by both parties, all of the effectively the body politic of North America, that are whoever wins the US election this year, that won't make much difference because both sides have declared themselves loyal to their colony in West Asia for the purposes of trying to control the whole of West Asia. And so this internal insurrection within North America becomes very important to break the morale of that international support, because if that is broken, if there is some serious deterioration in the political will to keep supporting the Zionist regime, then that is going to lead to catalyze the end of the Zionist regime. And then the resistance will be faced with this problem. Once again, it won't be finished then. Even if there's a collapse in the current regime, it won't be finished. There'll be a question of how is the new structure, the vacuum that's been created, for example, by the collapse of the Netanyahu government and perhaps the jailing of Netanyahu and other events such as that. How is that vacuum going to be filled, and what are the compromises that are going to be cut? It will be an extraordinary situation when it happens, I believe, and I think it will happen. And the world will be so shocked by the changes that the sponsors of the Israelis are forced to make, that the question of those details about land justice, about refugees, will become very important for the resistance, I believe. So that's why I think the work of resistance linked human rights organizations is very important today. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tim. Thank you so much. Now, let's please listen to Sundus Al-Assad, a pro-Palestine journalist. Please, Sundus, if you are ready, go ahead.
Salam everyone, my dear comrades and colleagues. Thanks for having me today. In conjunction with the ongoing Israeli genocidal war on Gaza, Palestinian women continue to pay a heavy price. Let us take the time to dwell on an important issue. Historically, women have been exposed to multiple sorts of injustices, a fact that cannot be denied. The so-called women's liberation movement, which has been launched in the West at the end of the 19th century, hasn't been in a vacuum. The goal was to obtain some public rights that men enjoy, such as education, work, and political rights. However, these just demands were quickly made by fallacies manipulated by the great powers that have worked to relentlessly obscure the distinctive feminine characteristics through manipulating women in the labor. It becomes clear that the real goal was not to empower them, but providing a labor force for factories that were emptied of their workers who joined the battlefields of World War I. This reveals that the empowering women slogan was not innocent. Rather, it has concealed the ongoing efforts to secure the interests of the economic forces that treat women as cheap labor, as they are enforced to work long hours in harsh and inhumane conditions. Psychologist Edward Louis Bernays, an American pioneer in the field of public relations, mentions in his book Propaganda that a cigarette company asked him in the 1930s to organize an advertising campaign to increase its sales. Bernays believed that the best way to increase cigarette sales is to convince women to smoke. Hence, he invited a number of models and actresses to participate in a march entitled Torches of Freedom, at a time when women smoking was socially unacceptable in the US. On the next day, the New York Times ran a headline, "Group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom." This incident has highly influenced the second wave of the so-called feminist movement in the 1960s. At that time, the women's movement was no longer a pure socio-political movement that protested against racial discrimination and the Vietnam War, but rather perpetuated the commodification of women policy by the new liberal system, which dealt with both women and men as mere consumers. French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu called it symbolic violence practiced by unconscious social mechanisms that perpetuate the dominance of the upper classes in order to prolong their dominance and not women's liberation. In our colonized countries, the Western system has manipulated women's issue as a tool of hegemony, domination, and control. This explains why we have systemically been invaded by various suspicious feminist NGOs, relying on unlimited financial support and unfortunately taking advantage of some existing and undeniable loopholes in a bid to destroy the family entity and its religious, ideological, and political identity. The current Israeli genocidal war on Gaza has exposed many hypocritical slogans and dropped the mask, whereby Palestinian women were left alone without any real support from these hypocritical feminist associations, who have turned a deaf ears and a blind eye as if the killing, displacement, starvation, and violation of their dignity is not within their interests. Instead of showing the unprecedented steadfast Palestinian women as a role model for all the women in the world. From this platform, I send my warm greetings to every Palestinian woman, to all the martyrs, the wounded, and the prisoners and resistance fighters have graduated. Those heroines are making history of Palestine and beyond. Also, I seize the occasion to send also my salams, especially in southern Lebanon and in our dear Yemen, and to every woman who has never get exhausted from going out to the streets to express rejection of the genocidal war against Gaza. Together, we create freedom, pride, and victory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sundus. Thank you. Now let's listen to the brother and colleague Ali Salam, the editor-in-chief of Basira Press. Please, brother Ali, go ahead.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. First of all, I want to send my greetings and salam to the noble Yemeni people who are hosting us today. I don't consider myself worthy even of the dust underneath their shoes of the Mujahideen. Even some of them don't have shoes. So it's a really humbling honor to be here. And I just want to, at the beginning, apologize because it's spring season. I have very bad allergies at this time. So I may have to interrupt myself for 10 seconds at a time if it ever gets very bad. So the topic I want to discuss today is the role of international organizations such as the UN and what role they play, or rather don't play, in the ending of the suffering of the people of Palestine and the ending of the occupation of Palestinian land. So the United Nations was created, as we all know, after World War II. And one of the first things that it did, maybe not the exact first things, but one of the first things that it did was basically voting to establish the Zionist entity. And it had support both from the United States and the Soviet Union at the time. Although the main power center of the support for Zionism went to the United States after there was a feud between Stalin and the Zionists, as he didn't think that they would be one of his satellites. And he ended up getting into a lot of disputes with various Zionist officials in Russia, such as Leon Trotsky, and it ended up with the Doctors Plot and everything like that. So the center of power for supporting Zionism went to the United States. Ever since then, the United Nations has kind of presented itself as this arbitrary, or sorry, not arbitrary, but impartial monitor of global affairs, that it would be a neutral place for people to settle their disputes, that it would be a place of fairness, and that it would be a source of hope for the downtrodden, basically. This has proven to be false. Time and time again, the UN has been a cover for the arrogant powers and a source of false hope and toothless statements for those who wish to seek justice against the arrogant powers who are killing their people, subjugating them, creating poverty, and many other sorts of crimes, both military and non-military alike. And for the longest time, until the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, people would think that only the UN was a source of settling their disputes. But the Islamic Revolution in 1979 showed the world that there is an alternative solution, because the UN is a quite godless power. It's based on secular liberalism and humanism and everything like that. And so it relies on the arrogance of man's ego in order to determine the direction of the world. Whereas the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Islamic Revolution, which is a global revolution, says that power comes from God, and we should rely on divine rubrics and divine criteria for justice and for who establishes power and everything like that. So resistance became the new equation, the new source of real hope for the oppressed peoples of the world, both Muslim and non-Muslim alike, because the Islamic Revolution inspired a lot of anti-colonial movements in other parts of the world. The problem with the UN is the UN Security Council veto power. And it has been the main tool in order to basically prevent any kind of settlements in favor of the oppressed, because the arrogant powers basically dominate the whole thing. Russia and China have a role in that, and they do help sometimes, but they are more pragmatic, and they also have their political interests, and they don't want to escalate too much because as we see just Russia defending the people of Donbass from an 8-year, basically ethnic cleansing campaign by the Ukrainian military, has resulted in Russia getting more sanctions than Iran. And defending Donbass is a very simple action. It's actually honestly not that big of a deal if we look at it in the bigger picture. But that's the consequence of what going against the arrogant powers leads to. So obviously they need to weigh the consequences of every move that they make, because it will lead to hardships for their countries. So the only nation that has no fear of America, that has no fear of the Zionists or the European powers is the Islamic resistance axis. They're willing to put up with any sorts of consequences in order to achieve justice for the oppressed and the downtrodden. So the United Nations will never use its time to seek real justice for the Palestinian people. It's only there to be a source of false hope. And even aside from that, it's actually a tool in the hands of the Americans and the Zionists to kind of create a new global order, which basically globalizes their oppression and globalizes their very sick agendas. Now, the things that I'm about to talk about may, on the surface, seem like they're not related to Palestine, but it actually is, because it's these same arrogant powers that are controlling this agenda. And it's these same arrogant powers that are actually using Palestine as a sort of testing ground. All the things that they're doing to Palestinians, since they don't view Palestinians as humans, is kind of like experimentation on various unjust tactics, torture tactics, surveillance, and biometrical surveillance, and all these types of things. I'm referring, of course, to the UN 2030 agenda. And to me, that's a blueprint for the so-called New World Order that they want to carry out. Now, I like that the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, may Allah lengthen his life, has kind of taken this term New World Order to kind of say, no, we are the ones, the God-centric powers of the world are the one who's going to create a new world order, not the satanic powers of the world. So in the view of the leader of the Islamic Revolution, the UN 2030 agenda is a very dangerous agenda that should not infiltrate our educational systems, political systems, or other sorts of systems in the world, any country in the world. Whether the colonizer or the colonized, is going to create a bad situation for all human beings on this planet. So it's a way for the Zionists and the Americans to globalize their oppression. He referred to its effect on the educational system as making people soldiers of the West. So this is going to brainwash our own people in the region of the resistance, to basically serve the agenda of the Americans. Because as was mentioned, the American unipolarity is declining. So as the American empire dies, like a plant without water kind of shoots all the nutrients up into its stems and gets rid of its seeds so that it can basically survive into the future. The essence of America, the ideology of America, will be essentially transferred, its life force transferred into a global body such as the UN, or something perhaps with more teeth. So the UN 2030 is kind of the vehicle for that process of America's decline, but without that hegemony disappearing. So they use terms like sustainable development, these sustainable development goals. That does not necessarily equal environmentalism, but it's actually a tool of green capitalism to deindustrialize the global South. Green energy and alternative energy is very beneficial and very good, but it is not at the point yet to replace petroleum fuels. So as Russian President Vladimir Putin said in a criticism of environmental activist Greta Thunberg, that this would basically create massive poverty in Africa, in West Asia, and other places that rely on petroleum fuels, because it's not feasible or practical for them, especially when they're not developed yet. They don't have the type of infrastructure yet to survive. For example, in Yemen, it's been bombed to who knows what extent by the Saudis, and it's been starved. Petrochemical fuels will be the best and most efficient way to rebuild Yemen so it can have a decent standard of living. European countries that already have the standard of living can afford to do so. So basically, they want to use green energy, as beneficial as it is, as a weapon against the global South. Now, this agenda also includes the destruction of the family, as the previous speaker mentioned, because it targets by targeting the family, they target the social fabric of these societies. The resistance axis would not exist if it was not for the equation of the God-centric family unit. This is what produces our Shahid Soleimanis and Abu Ubaidas and Shahid Ibrahim al-Nabulsi's, rahmatullah alayhim, and upon all of our martyrs. So the spread of LGBT and the sexualization of children is something that will definitely be a part of this agenda. And there was even a UN document that promoted, that said that children as young as 4 or 5 have sexual tendencies and everything like that. It was deleted, but thankfully another website preserved it, and it's up at basirpress.org and our analysis on the UN 2030 agenda. Another agenda, and this is based on the technology that Israelis use against Palestinians, is biometric surveillance, a kind of a technological tyranny. This is being developed in part by Bill Gates with the digital ID and ID 2020. And this is done in tandem with the agenda of the pharmaceutical mafia to get basically everybody's medical records onto a system. They're also targeting foods and making sure that the only a handful of corporations have control over the food industry through or so-called meatless meat or things like that. Through the currency system, they also want to basically kind of starve people into submission. Like, for example, these protesters in the US, how easy would it be to basically starve them into submission if all their currency and their money was digital on a digital wallet? This is called central bank digital currency, CBDC. So if basically someone disagrees with America or the Zionists or whatever global institution they want to kind of transfer their power to as they decline as an empire, they just delete you. They delete all your money. And they kind of want to create these kind of global tyrannies, tyrannical systems, such as for example, 15-minute cities. People can research into it. As much as Elon Musk pretends to be independent or he's some kind of maverick for free speech, his electric cars will play a very important role in making sure that people kind of stay confined within these 15 minutes prisons. So in short, the resistance axis plays a very, very big role in defeating not only the military agenda of the Zionist regime, but the kind of greater social and political and cultural agenda, such as the UN 2030 agenda. Iran is the only country in the world, I think, that actually fully rejects this agenda. Its leader openly rejects this agenda. Of course, naturally, Iran's allies in the resistance axis also have a similar feeling because they view Imam Khamenei as the kind of spiritual and political guide that sets the trends. So as much as these very creepy satanic people want to create a kind of global technological tyranny, which they are testing on the Palestinians today, all their various methods that they want to use against the rest of the world, it is us who should create the new world order under the guardianship of God, and not these satanic powers who want to create this very dark, hopeless world where all our moves are tracked. If we have the wrong thought, our bank accounts will be frozen and we can't even feed our families anymore. Our children will be exposed and their innocence will be destroyed by these highly sexualized materials. And economic war will be waged against us by telling us we can't use petrochemical energy in order to build our countries to the same par as the European countries. So I think that the resistance option is the most important option for defeating Zionism and all the other agendas of global arrogance. It's the resistance option. The UN is, I would actually call them the useless nations because we should not rely on them. They're a source of health. So our hope should be in the resistance. And that's my humble contribution to this conversation. And may Allah bless everybody in resistant Yemen. And it's my honor to be speaking to you today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much, Brother Ali. I really thank you all for your precious time. But before I let you go, we as Insan Organization, we have a suggestion here, and I hope that you like it. We suggest that we choose a day, for an example, the 220 days of killing for the Palestinian people. We choose that day and ask and mobilize the human rights activists and journalists, media activists, and to protest in front of the US and Israeli embassies in our cities. We will discuss this further, inshallah, in WhatsApp. I will discuss this with you, and if we could do that for the Palestinian people, that would be, supporting the Palestinians is a humanitarian and religious obligation for us as Yemenis, and humanitarian obligation for all the people around the world. So think about that, please, and I will discuss that with you later, inshallah, on WhatsApp. Thank you so much for your precious time. I hope that we will keep in touch and hold, inshallah, further meetings for supporting our brothers in Palestine, particularly in Gaza, who are still being killed by the Israeli occupation. Thank you so much.